in this lecture, we're going to spend some more time on sound. And what we're going to see is based on the fact that now you understand that the actual sounds of language are quite different from the way we transcribe them onto paper or print them on paper. And now that you understand that the sounds in a language are related in ways that the arbitrary sequence of the alphabet cannot indicate and does not indicate. And so, armed with that, you're in a position to understand that one of the most basic aspects of the way we generate language, and today we're going to see this on the level of sound, we'll see it in other ways later, is that there is what's called an underlying form, and then there's a surface form. There are two levels, an original, foundational level, and then there's what happens when we actually present what we want to say to the world. This is called, in linguistics, the difference between the phonemic and the phonetic. And so let me give you a want to say to the world. This is called, in linguistics, the difference between the phonemic and the phonetic. And so let me give you a sense of what I mean. The basic insight here is that what comes out on the surface is often quite different from the way the brain originally generates it. So let's take the words in English bat and pat. They are obviously different words. What makes the difference is that bat begins with B and pat begins with P. But that is not the relationship between B and P in all languages. Let's take a language which is not English, such as Korean. In Korean, there are no words that begin with B, there are no words that end with B, and in fact, in the mind of a Korean speaker, there is no quote-unquote letter B. That's not there. Now, if you listen to a Korean talking, you would hear buzz here and there. However, it's a different kind of b than our b. In Korean, b is just something that happens to p depending on where p happens to be in the word. To be more specific, b is something that happens to p when p happens to fall between two vowels. Now, here's what I mean. There is a word in Korean, pup. That means law. Now, notice, if you see pup on the screen, that the vowel is a schwa. Now, if we were just using ordinary spelling, how in the world would we write pup? And however we chose to write it, with a U or something else, we'd have to explain it to whoever we were writing this for. There'd have to be an informal agreement. Now, one of the uses of the IPA is that we can have this sound, which in Korean plays a different role than it does in English, and we can just write pup, and there it is. There'd be no way to write it in English for everybody to understand. So, in any case, the word law is pup. Now, just like in English, there are prefixes and suffixes in Korean that will change the, if we will, part of speech of a word. And so the word for law is pup, and then the word for lawlessness involves putting a prefix on the word, and it happens to be mu. You don't have to worry about the details, but you say law, and then if you want to say lawlessness, then you would think you would say mupup, like this. However, in fact, the word is not mupup. And that's because there is this rule in Korean. Whenever a p winds up between two vowels, then it becomes a b. Now, that's not so counterintuitive, we know now. because it used to be that in this primordial era, we thought of B and P as where they are in the alphabet, but now we know P and B are both bilabial stops. They're only different in terms of the fact that P is voiceless and B is voiced. So these sounds are like two peas in a pod. And so P changes to something when it's between two vowels. And what it changes to, rather predictably, is its voiced counterpart. And so you've got this B in there. So what this means is that in Korean, B is just something that happens to P sometimes. It's just something that happens kind of later in the process. There's no word B. That would never happen. It would be P. The P only changes to B when there's a vowel before it. And so mu B. And that means that in Korean, B is not a real sound. P is a real sound. B is just something that happens to P sometimes. And even when Korean writes mupuk, it writes the B sound with a P because the real word under there is puk. And to them, mubuk is just the way that you pronounce mupuk. And so B is just something that happens to P. There is no real B. Now take that from Korean and mentally put that aside. And now we're going to look at a different case which complements it, and then I'll bring these things together to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Let's use English. Say pot, and then say spot. Now, in both cases, you've got a P. But when you say pot, if you put your hand in front of your face, you feel a puff, pot.
Pot.
If you say spot, you don't feel that puff, or you feel much less of one. Don't be too explicit, the way you really say it. Pot, spot. So there are two different ways of saying P. Now, when you say it with the puff, as in pot, what you're doing, it has a term. It's called aspiration. And so that's an aspirated version of a P. Now, that kind of P, the kind of puffy P, that only happens when the P is at the beginning of a word or at the beginning of a syllable, like in capacity. That's where that occurs. And so there are actually two kinds of P's. There's P and there's P. We don't usually say it in isolation, but there's the P that's in spat. Spat doesn't have a puff. So there's puffy P and puffless P. P and P.
Pot, spot, pot.